third hour of the Elias Macko Show. Thanks for joining us on this Friday. We are with you straight through until noon. Now, last week, we told you about a seismic shift from one of the biggest climate action voices out there ahead of this week's Global Climate Summit in Brazil, COP30. Bill Gates dropped a new memo that rattled the consensus of the climate movement. Here is Bill Gates in an interview on CNBC last week.
Climate is a super important problem. There's enough innovation here to avoid super bad outcomes. We won't achieve our best goal, the 1.5 or even the 2 degrees. And as we go about trying to minimize that, we have to frame it in terms of overall human welfare, not just everything should be solely for climate.
Now, Gates argues that while climate change is real and serious, it will not lead to humanity's demise. And he suggests we've overemphasized near-term emissions targets and undervalued the twin crises of poverty and disease. Our next guest is a former climate activist who found herself standing shoulder to shoulder with the likes of Greta Thunberg and others. But now she's also raising concerns about climate alarmism and doomerism. Our pleasure to welcome Lucy Biggers onto the program, a writer and head of social media over at The Free Press. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Tell me you get free Paramount Plus now after you guys were bought by Paramount.
I'm waiting for that to come through. My first question is my son is always watching Paw Patrol on there.
Lucy, listen, it's a tremendous pleasure to talk to you here. We have a lot to discuss. First things first. Last week, when Bill Gates dropped that memo, what was your reaction?
So I have two reactions. My first reaction was a little bit pettier. I was frustrated because I have been speaking out against climate alarmism for the better part of a year. Because for background, I was a climate activist in my 20s, and then I started having a change of heart in 2020 and sort of went silent for 4 or 5 years because I was so afraid of the backlash. And then earlier this year, I decided to start speaking out against climate alarmism. Of course, I got so much backlash, and the scientists who have been doing this before me, there's so many people like Judith Curry, Steve Koonin, Gregory Wrightstone, John Christie. I could go on and on. There's amazing, brave scientists who've been doing this for years and been basically ostracized and kicked out of the mainstream and labeled as climate deniers. So my initial reaction was a little bit more petty. I was frustrated that, of course, now Bill Gates can say this in a calculated way because the winds have kind of shifted politically and it's safe to come out and say this. And he didn't really acknowledge the fact that all these people's careers have been ruined for saying the same thing he's now saying. And then now that the dust has settled, I'm a little less emotional. I'm, trying to be the bigger person. I think overall it's a net positive for everybody because it just moves the Overton window on this. And I really believe that the climate movement, where it was headed, and many factions of it are still headed this direction because you can see that with how much backlash Bill Gates has gotten from the movement. But basically, the doomerism and saying this is an existential threat, it's causing a mental health crisis among young people. And it's also really preventing us from still using, not preventing us, but it's hurting, fossil fuel exploration and using fossil fuels, which we know we still really need them right now for probably several more decades. And so I think this is great. Let's prioritize human prosperity and flourishing, but I am still, a little salty.
and trust me, I can totally understand why. I think I would like to know, and our listeners would love to know about, how'd you end up in climate activism? Like, how do you end up at one point being next to Greta Thunberg? I'd love to know how you got to that in the first place. Yeah,
so I worked at a news company called Now This News, which is a very progressive Facebook news company. It was known for its Facebook videos and yellow text on screen. We sort of created that style back in the 2010s. So in my 20s, while I was there, I started covering protests against pipelines. The Dakota Access Pipeline was the big one that happened in 2016. And from just covering that, I just made climate change my beat. And so I just was on the beat of the Green New Deal. And when Greta was having her protests, my producer reached out to her team and we were able to go cover it. And ultimately, I think for me, I was a younger person, I was a progressive, and I was idealistic. And the way that the climate movement was messaged to me was, this is the right side of history, right? Like, these evil fossil fuel companies are extracting this oil. We don't even need oil anymore. And this is an existential threat to our civilization. And so how can I not get on board with fighting for the climate and for our future? What I didn't understand, and now looking back, is that most of my knowledge, this is very embarrassing, came from documentaries that were really biased. So just like Leonardo DiCaprio had a film in 2015, Before the Flood, and I just took it at face value. It was the most scary projections about climate change that have not come true and will not come true, just about, cities being underwater and crop failures and all these things. And so I didn't question the mainstream narrative around climate. And then anyone who did, if I would see someone like an Alex Epstein who speaks out in support of fossil fuels, and he's now he's actually a huge inspiration for me. If I would see a counterpoint, I just was in such groupthink at the time that I never questioned it, because I thought anyone who's not part of this is just a fossil fuel shill or a crazy conservative. And so I just lived in groupthink and didn't question that black and white messaging.
So let me tell you, Lucy, I've been a radio host now at this show for 7 years and been in media for much longer than that. And I remember Greta Thunberg came to Montreal once. And hundreds of thousands of Montrealers, and mostly young people, they went onto the streets, right?
Right.
And the messaging was, we're all going to die if we don't do something. And politically here in Montreal, you had the mayor of Montreal, who has been banging the drum that we're in a climate crisis and she's leaving, but she's been banging that drum for 8 years. And the Prime Minister of Canada at the time, Justin Trudeau, banging that same drum. And covering it as a host, every time I'd have to talk about the subject, I'd have to preface my comments, because one of my big things was like, listen, guys, we're not all going to die. Like the doomerism is crazy is what my messaging was. But listen, yes, climate change is real. And I'd have to preface my comments so that I wouldn't be branded as some sort of denier right off the bat. And so I guess the next question I have for you is like, when was the moment where the pivot started for you? When did it start where you said, okay, something's wrong here, something doesn't add up?
Right. So I think for me, there was a cognitive dissonance for me when I was covering it. And especially even as I started to cover it for 5 years, from 2016 to 2021, the more you spend on a topic, you start to see the nuances of it. Just simple things like another dogma of the climate movement was like plastic, single-use plastic is so bad. And obviously there's issues with it when it's in the environment, but, single-use plastic is very great. It's actually very versatile. It's very lightweight. It's a byproduct of fossil fuels. So there's all these other sides of it that actually, if you were to present the whole case for plastics, it's not that crazy to say, you know what, it shouldn't end up in nature, but it's really useful. And so that's just one example. And basically, as I was covering the topic and getting more and more familiar with everything, I started to go, I'm not really covering this honestly. I'm really just covering a slice of if it was a pie chart, like I'm covering like 20% of something and highlighting the bad parts, and I'm ignoring the 70% or whatever, 80% of why things are the way that they are, right? So I just always had a doubt, and I felt like by the time I was getting older, so now I'm like 30, 31 in 2020 and 2021, I started to be like a hypocrite where my privately held beliefs were different and more nuanced and more skeptical. And then my public persona was still, beating the party drum. And then I think, during that COVID time, obviously we have the lockdowns. I think a lot of people started to question things. For me, seeing everyone all of a sudden wearing single-use plastic masks and all the plastic barriers everywhere, I was like, wait a minute. If I were to avoid plastic straws for the rest of my life, it really would not change anything, because we're fine even with all the plastic we're using during COVID. Seeing also during COVID when the whole entire world shut down, right? And our climate emissions, I think, globally went down by 5%. And that made me realize, wait a minute, if the climate movement gets what it wants and we get to net zero, what does that world look like? Because I don't actually want to live in a world where we're at net zero if it means the world has to be shut down. And so that kind of pushed me to read alternative sources. I read Michael Schellenberger's book, Apocalypse Never.
So great. What a great book.
So great.
Yeah,
he's great. He's actually a friend of mine now, and another mentor person I'm connected with. So I read that in 2020 secretly. I didn't tell a soul. I listened to that on tape. I ate it up. It was so good. And then I read Unsettled by Steve Koonin that I think came out in 2021 or 2022. And so I started reading, and then ultimately what had happened was I was a public persona at my old job pushing climate stuff. I left that job, and I also had my first son. And so I just went kind of quiet, but kept studying and kind of really picking away at like, oh my gosh, like I really am not believing anything. I'm almost believing the opposites of most of the things I was pushing. And only this year was it when I decided to go public with it, because I was so afraid for many years of just the vitriol of the pushback. And so I thought to myself, well, I've changed all my opinions. I guess I'm just going to be behind the scenes for the rest of my life. And I'm never going to talk about my changed opinions. But then ultimately I just, like anyone in life, you kind of have to hit a crossroads and say like, what type of life do you want to lead?
Can I just ask you?
So I went public with it again this summer. Only this spring, it was when I first started going public.
Can I ask you
saying that basically I think it's a scam.
I want to ask you quickly here if you've lost friends over it.
Yeah, I think fake friends for sure. Like acquaintances from work that like we were close, but no one who, has been to my house or anything like that.
Gotcha.
So I don't have many people that I'm in touch with from that job but I have actually stayed in touch with a lot of people who I was friends with through the activism space. I think I've kept more friends, surprisingly, because the ones that were my real friends privately might say to me like, hey, I see what you're saying. Like, I'm not going to say it, but I agree. It's not like that crazy what you're saying. Or they've had similar changes of heart, but they don't speak about it publicly. So I definitely still have some people in that space. And they would message me and say like, hey, like, thank you for what you've done. And so, but yeah, my old coworkers, no, like when I first came out, they were like commenting, being like, you've changed. Like, I'm disappointed. I was like,
Lucy, let's keep this conversation going. I want to talk to you about two things when we return: the mental health aspects of this, and what our listeners really do need to know about the future and where we're actually headed. All right, welcome back to the Elias Macko Show. We're continuing our discussion with Lucy Biggers, a writer at the Free Press, a climate activist turned into a climate realist. Lucy, thanks for sticking around with our listeners.
Of course.
Now, one of the things you mentioned in the last half of our conversation was the effect of climate alarmism and doomerism on mental health. I'm so happy you brought this up. I want you to listen to something here. This happened just about a month ago in the House of Commons in Ottawa, where these climate activists, this is a member of the Canadian Youth Climate Assembly, was in Ottawa, our nation's capital, to demand more on mental health surrounding climate change. Have a listen to her.
We urge parliamentarians to mandate and support the provision of continued and long-term mental health resources across provinces and territories so that all Canadians can access care from climate-induced trauma, distress, and duress. We want to see an emphasis on community wellness and making resources available virtually and in person to allow all Canadians to stay connected. Such resources include hotlines, call and text, for individuals struggling due to the effects of climate change, websites with related resources, and support groups where people can share their own experiences.
What kind of a disaster has this alarmism been on mental health?
Yeah, so the polling that's out there shows that a majority of young people have fear and anxiety around the environment because of the climate change narrative. And the extent of that from person to person is different. Some people have, they can't sleep. They have intrusive thoughts about it every day. Other people, maybe it's just a subconsciously held assumption that the world is burning, right? And we're to blame. And so I think all of that is destructive, whether it's just a little bit or, it's the level of that one young woman. And what did she say?
Climate-induced trauma.
Okay, yeah, that was the line that I laughed at, because it's not climate-induced trauma, it's media-induced trauma. Because I can guarantee you, if this young woman went outside and has experienced the weather in her life and had never heard of the narrative from the media, she would not be traumatized by the weather, because she has not experienced weather that's extreme. Because as the IPCC scientists, which is the big report that the UN puts together, shows, there's not been an extreme increase. There has not been an increase in extreme weather, things you think of like hurricanes, floods, wildfires. Those things have not increased because of climate change. And also wildfires, I'm just thinking in Canada, I know you guys had some bad wildfires like 2 years ago or something, which I think were started by arsons.
Yeah.
But those wildfire levels globally are down 25%. So I think the media is so irresponsible in the way that they cover this, because when there is a wildfire, there's always the headline, made worse by climate change, or this is our reality now because of climate change, or get ready, every wildfire season for the rest of your life is going to look like this. Like, we know the headlines and the really irresponsible coverage. And so what I would like to see from the media is just some responsibility, adding in the stuff that's like, globally, wildfire rates are down 25%. You know, and arson started this wildfire. Like, so it's just, this person doesn't have trauma from the weather. They have trauma from the media.
And I wish they would also add, historically, we've never had less people dying due to natural disaster.
That should be in every article.
Yeah.
It's so, the misinformation and the psyop that's happening is so crazy. And I'm not saying that it's even intentional. I think because as my background was, I worked in a newsroom. So when I was in a newsroom and I had been, brainwashed or influenced by these really irresponsible documentaries that I watched, I then decided in my newsroom the way that we were going to cover climate change was going to make sure that when we said climate change, we always said climate crisis.
Yes, yeah.
And I said that because that's what we're supposed to do. It's an existential threat. I'm seeing other newsrooms doing it. So that's how we're going to cover climate change. And I didn't say it was a crisis because people were dying more, right, or weather was getting worse. I never even looked at that data. I just did it because other places were doing it. And so that's what's happening with most mainstream media is that they just see other places doing it and they do it too. And it's just it's very frustrating. And most people don't even realize how manipulated they are.
I have a minute or so left. And by the way, I'll agree with you on what comes out of the media. I can't believe it at times, right? And I'm in the media. But I also want to ask you about teachers. Like, one of my concerns, like, I think if I were to go into a high school in the Montreal area and go to classroom and ask the teacher at the front of the classroom what they think about climate change. Right. I think that's a big part of this here. And I wonder if you have a thought about high school teachers and academia in making this into something that is a crisis in every teen's mind.
Yes, I think that's happening, and I would have to do, and I hope to do more research on what kids are being taught. And I know in some states, they've passed laws that they have to teach this. And I've been saying for a while, and I've held the belief for many years, that this is not something you should be definitely not teaching to elementary school. I don't even think middle school kids should teach about it. I think it should be a course that maybe you take in high school as an elective by choice. And it's funny because I remember saying that, and someone I worked with who was very progressive was like, well, they need to know. It's like their responsibility. And I think that's like the ideological difference, is that the people who are bought into the sort of more progressive movement and teachers, right, who choose to just, they feel like it's their duty to like burden kids with this knowledge as if the kids can do anything about it. And I'm more in the protectionist. I want to protect kids and protect their childhood. And really, whether they know about it or not, they can't do anything about it. And ultimately, I would say that it's not something to be afraid of at all. And so we really need to protect kids. And I think, even though we have Bill Gates, right, how we started this conversation, he's changed his mind. So many systems, whether it's the curriculum or the nonprofits that make money off of this, the scientists who only get published for covering climate change stuff, all of these incentives exist to keep pushing the climate alarmism. So we have a lot of work to do to bring the realist perspective into the mainstream and not have it be some sort of taboo topic that people don't want to touch.
Lucy, thanks for joining us today with some realism on climate. I really appreciate it. Hopefully we can catch up again, okay?
Yeah, thank you for having me on.
That's Lucy Biggers right there, a writer and head of social media at The Free Press. When we return on the Elias Macko Show, Akil Aline's going to join us. You know him and love him from the Big Five, and we'll get his take on what we saw south of the border this week in the various Tuesday elections. That's next.
I'm Dylan Playfair.
And I'm Tyler Smith.
We're putting loneliness in the penalty box by talking to some of our favorite athletes about the importance of friendship.
This is Bromance.
Bromance is brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, proudly Canadian-owned and operated. Charm has been part of your love stories and bromances for over 50 years.
And you can find Bromance on the iHeartRadio network or wherever you get your podcasts.